I am blood. All right, I think we're rolling. So we continue on with the third section of this course. There is a final exam in here. It's going to be exactly the same with one difference. One of your observations will have to be comprehensive. All right. So one of your observations will pull in material from the entire class. It's going to be a big deal. It's not like you need to like memorize anything or take an in-class test, right? So if you did a good job on test 1 and 2, you should be able to recycle that material into a third comprehensive observation for the final exam. So just be aware of that. You'll have 2 observations from the last test, so the Jefferson lectures and then the Civil War lectures coming up, and then 1 comprehensive, and that's your final exam. It'll be due the Friday at finals week, noon, I think. Any questions about that? Remember, no class on Thursday. Enjoy an early Thanksgiving, at least from the standpoint of History 141. All right, let's get to it. We are talking about the Civil War. A number of you have already blown through the Civil War. You've gone through chapters 10, even some of you even to chapters 11 of the Maclay book already. So this is old hat. A lot of what I'll be going through starting today and the week after Thanksgiving, I'll be covering events that are pretty well covered in Maclay. So you'll have nice reinforcement. What I'll be doing is just providing kind of a different framework for thinking about some of those things. So that's what we're doing. Of course, one of the questions to come out of early American history is, why did the Civil War occur? All right, what are the common answers to why the Civil War occurred? What are the 2 main competing answers for why the Civil War occurred? Come on now, you had a coach. You had this in high school. What coach teach you? What are the 2 main competing answers for why the Civil War occurred? Slavery. When somebody says slavery, what's sometimes put up is kind of the counter. States' rights. Slavery versus states' rights. Both of those explanations are right, but incomplete. Move. In order to understand, I'll give you kind of the man on the street, Uncle Jim asked you at Thanksgiving, answer to why the Civil War occurred. But I also want us to try to understand this question in all of its complexity, right? Explaining causation, why something happens, can take place at many different levels, right? Slavery, states' rights, they work at one explanation. Another answer to that question, why did the Civil War occur? Well, in 1860, we elected probably the most sectional president in our history, right? Abraham Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states, and yet he still won the presidency. Y'all are familiar with crisis of representation. You've had a number of presidential elections in which there have been a crisis of representation, maybe in your lifetime, but nothing of it compares to 1860 with what happened. So that's one, but even there, it's not like the South needed to secede from the Union just because Lincoln was elected, right? They chose to, and it's not like Lincoln had to hold the Union or preserve the Union, he chose to. So there's many different levels, I think, in which we can answer this question. I want to help us understand kind of the broadest framework for why the Civil War occurred. And one answer to why did the Civil War occur would be to say the American Revolution. Many Civil War historians, most of us in fact, call the Civil War a second American Revolution, because we understand that the Civil War is ultimately about trying to resolve questions that were left unresolved by the American Revolution. Particularly the identity question. What is the United States? You might be looking at the screen there and you're seeing two words, Union and Confederacy. Of course, in the Civil War, the North being the Union, the South being the Confederacy. Those terms that didn't come out of nowhere. These are terms that are in circulation from the 1790s all the way into the Civil War era. What is the United States? Are we a union? Right? This is the common way that Alexander Hamilton liked to talk about the United States. Are we a union of states that could not be dissolved? Or are we a confederacy? This is the preferred term of Hamilton's great rival, Thomas Jefferson. Are we a confederacy, a union of equal and sovereign states that could be dissolved? And many of you noted in your weekly readings of the Clay, many of you were surprised at just how unpopular the Constitution was. You were surprised to see people like George Washington saying, yeah, I give it about 20 years or so, right? There's a lot of ambivalence that the Constitution was going to be able to do what the Constitution promised to do, right? Purpose of the Constitution, creating more perfect union. A lot of people were like, man, our divisions, they run so deep. I don't think this Constitution is going to be able to create that more perfect union. In many ways, Washington was right. He was just a little early. If he had said like maybe 50, if he had said like 60 years instead of 20 years, it would have been pretty prophetic. But the reality is that just because we pass a constitution with the word union in it, it doesn't mean that a majority of Americans accepted that as our identity. We continued to debate that question. Most of our political debates after 1789 and the full ratification of the Constitution resolved around this question. What are we, a union, a union of sovereign states that could not be dissolved, or a confederacy, a group of sovereign states that could be dissolved when one state believed that the union had become tyrannical or what have you. Right? And we have to understand, because look, just because it's the South that ultimately pulls the trigger of disunion in 1860, we have to see, and we will be seeing as we go through this time, it's both sides playing the disunion card, right? The best metaphor I can think of for making sense of the United States between 1790 and 1860 is to think of a marriage in which both sides are willing to play the divorce card. Right? Both sides are willing to say, if you don't buy me that car, I'm going to divorce you. If you don't cook pot roast for dinner tonight, I'm going to divorce you. Hopefully I'm not hitting close to home. I know that there are homes and marriages that are like this, right? Where the divorce card is played. The divorce card is used as a tool of manipulation. It's awful. It's particularly awful for kids in that kind of way. Right? This is the United States. The United States, between 1790 and 1860, is like a married couple who are constantly throwing the divorce card at each other. And we would not think any marriage in which people are doing that is a good marriage. We would not think any union like the United States, where both sides are continually threatening this union, would be a good union. But before we can figure out what divides Americans, we first have to figure out what unites us. What is it that unites Americans? Because what unites Americans is ultimately the things that divides us, right? There's all kinds of ironies or paradoxes in American history, at least is the way that I understand American history. This is one of those central ones. The very thing that united Americans between 1820 and 1860 is ultimately the thing that divided them in the end. Manifest destiny. That's something you know pretty well from Coach. Coach usually covers this pretty well. What is manifest destiny? What does this refer to? westward expansion, right? It's our God-given responsibility, even right, to expand to the west to fill up the west. The guy who coins that term, John O'Sullivan, he was a group of reformers known as the Young Americans. It's ultimately in 1845 in his magazine, The Democratic Review, where he uses this term manifest destiny for the first time. It's interesting that the term is coined as late as 1845. Manifest destiny is largely complete by that point. And even the way that O'Sullivan talks about it, right? It was the fulfillment of our manifest destiny to fill up this continent. And he goes on to talk about how America is going to play kind of this world leading role. We're going to set an example for the rest of the world by the great freedom that we have here, right? But by the time that manifest destiny is coined, by 1845, it's largely done. We know from the Louisiana Purchase, transcontinental treaty that we've talked about, legally we have secured rights to sea to shining sea, Mexican-American War, Texas annexation, the southwestern part of the United States is coming into the control of the United States. We have pioneers stretching throughout the North American continent by 1845. So manifest destiny is in many ways complete, but we know that it had been going on before then. We talked about Western expansion under the Jefferson presidency. We know even before that this idea of manifest destiny doesn't just like come out of nowhere, right? I mean, 100 years before this, people like Ben Franklin and John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, we know that they did what they did because they believed that America's future lay to the west, believed the future lay in Western expansion. It's ultimately an imperial ideal. We think of imperialism as something that a nation has to cross an ocean to be able to do. No, the foreign occupation of lands that don't belong to you, well, that's essentially what the United States did in filling up the continent, right? That was land that didn't belong to us. In one way or another, we figured out how to secure it under our United States. It was an imperialistic mission. Our Mexican-American War especially was an imperialistic war, but it was one that we believe that God called us. It was God's mission. It's interesting, like the founding fathers, they did not talk in like God language to talk about Western expansion. The language of manifest destiny very much shows, you would have encountered, some of you would have encountered this in the Maclay readings already, the Second Great Awakening and the kind of great Christian energy coming out of the 1820s and thereafter. The language of Western expansion in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s very much has a Christian bent, right? It's a God-given, it's even a Christian mission to go out and fill up this continent. The important thing, one, is to understand about manifest destiny is this ideal of Western expansion has been around for a long time. Expansion, territorial expansion is something that is endemic to the United States from even before there wasn't. So our expansion in the 20th century shouldn't surprise us, given our history of expansion in the 19th century. The other thing that's important to understand about manifest destiny is that this is a unifying movement. Northerners, Southerners, they both believe our future lay out west. The future of the United States fell to Western expansion, right? Who were some of the great, expansionists of the years before the Civil War? Thomas Jefferson, not a Yankee, a Southerner. John Quincy Adams, very much a Northerner. The son of Jefferson's rival at one point, John Adams. Right, so this is something that united Americans, North and South, this Western expansion, as somehow going to be the future for the United States, right? America had an incredibly young population. in 1800, where are those young men and women going to find opportunities? They are going to find opportunities out west. Go west, young man and young woman. That is where America's future lies. So this was something that united Americans. This is a political map of the United States in 1856. The different colors show you free territory, slave territory, and unclaimed territory. My point is, written into the very maps of the United States, right? I mean, a basic way of, what is the United States? One of the most basic things you could do, if space alien comes down, what is the United States? The most basic thing you can do is hold up a map to that space alien and say, it's this. This is what the United States looks like. And what would that space alien be thinking in 1856? Wow, that slavery issue. That seems to be really determinative for you. I mean, it's literally written all over you. The difference between being slave states and free states. Look, here's your man on the street Thanksgiving answer. When Uncle Joe asks you, hey, what are you studying in college? And oh, well, we're studying the origins of the Civil War. Why did the Civil War occur? Uncle Joe will ask you. Here's the answer you give him. You can talk to him about, the Second American Revolution, all that stuff if you want. And we will continue to explore that frame as we go through. But the simplest answer to the question of why did the Civil War occur? Slavery is sort of right, but it's incomplete. Because I think a lot of Americans, when they say, well, the Civil War was caused over slavery, what they mean is it was a debate over the morality of slavery. It was a debate over those Americans who believed slavery was immoral and those who believed that it was either moral or beneficial. And that is not what the Civil War was fought over. The Civil War was not fought over the morality of slavery. The Civil War was fought over the expansion of slavery. Yankees, Southerners, all of their differences with each other were more than content to let each other live in their existing bounds. When the question came up, whose vision of the West should dominate? Whose society should be able to move out west? Northern free society or Southern slave society? That is when the Union fell apart again and again and again. Now, the expansion of slavery, it doesn't explain all the tensions between Northerners and Southerners, as we'll see after Thanksgiving break. But the most significant conflicts that will take place between 1790 and 1860 between North and South were over questions of the expansion of slavery. So understand the irony here. You have something that unites Americans, a belief not only that we should expand to the West, but we have to expand to the West. That the future of the United States is dependent upon Western expansion. But at every point that we look to expand after 1800, the question comes up, does slavery go or not? And the Southern answer is yes. And the Northern answer is no. Why don't Northerners want slavery to expand to the West? It's because Northerners were anti-slavery, because Northerners were anti-racist. Hopefully from last week's lecture, you know the answer to that already. Northerners did not want slavery in their particular states. They were fine with slavery. Most Northerners were fine with slavery in its existing bounds. In fact, some Northerners were actively pro-slavery. It has everything to do with the intense racism of the typical Yankee of the 19th century. Northerners were anti-slavery. But interestingly, their anti-slavery was part of their profound racism. They didn't want to have contact with persons of color in any way, shape, or form. We saw this already. As soon as slavery ended in northern states, Northerners immediately began a process of segregating, of marginalizing persons of color. There was no commitment to racial equality or racial inclusion. Now, there were very rare exceptions, and we'll talk about those, even some of them maybe today. But for the most part, the average Northerner, his vision, her vision of the North was intensely racist. There was not just no slavery, it was no persons of color whatsoever. And so they were pro-slavery because pro-slavery meant that people of color would be confined to the South. As long as a person was enslaved in Alabama, they would not move to Pennsylvania. This was a Northerner's great fear, that if slavery ended in the South, African Americans would begin to travel. They would begin to travel north. So we have to get over this idea of, more generally, we have to get over this idea. I think somebody mentioned it before, you know, North good, South bad, or Union good, Confederacy bad, as though somehow the Union had the moral upper hand on slavery. Yes, it's true that, as we've talked about, northern states ended slavery between 1780 and 1820. They did not end racism. In fact, they became even more racist in many ways in the South. Their societies literally were white supremacist societies. And we talked about this, the whole idea of the white man's republic was something that is largely coming out of northern states and northern politicians. And so, big surprise, when Northerners look out west, they see an intensely racialized vision of the West. They see a lily white West, a West in which only white sons and daughters get to go out and have economic opportunities. If slavery was able to expand into the West, that would threaten the economic opportunities of white people. It could also mess with the racial hierarchy. What would happen if, say, a white daughter started marrying men of color? Hard to talk about, but this is the North. This is the intensely racist vision of the North. And it's one that they look to expand to the West. Look, I'll talk more about this in different points in the lecture, but look, Northerners' vision of the West was so racist, they didn't even want free persons of color being able to move. Several Midwestern states passed laws banning even free persons of color from living in. Illinois, it was illegal if you're a person of color to live in Illinois. They literally driven you out of the state through whips. Indiana in the 1850s. And yes, John Ball's Michigan. John Ball would have been a Michigan senator when Michigan voted to ban even free persons of color from living in this state. So we really have to get over this idea that just because the Yankees were anti-slavery, that they were somehow, you know, racially inclusive or racially accepting. It was just the opposite. They were even more intense in their white supremacy, and they tried to secure that through law, particularly when they looked out west. So there's no way that Northerners were going to accept slave expansion for economic reasons, for social reasons. Southerners, on the other hand, could not imagine the South apart from expansion, the expansion of their slave system, because they couldn't imagine the South apart from the expansion of cotton production. Right, as cotton really begins to take off as the not just the Southern economy, but really center of the American economy after 1820. You know, if you really want to make money, you got to keep planting cotton again, you know, each year, right? You got to keep planting cotton again and again and again. You got to plant as much cotton as you can, right? Because cotton is driving not just the national economy, it's driving the international economy. In the first half of the 19th century. What do we know about planting a crop like cotton again and again and again each year? It destroys it, right? I mean, any kind of monocultural farming is bad. We know that crop rotation is ultimately best if you want to kind of preserve the you know, a fertile land. But cotton in particular is especially hard on them. So Southerners could already imagine they're going to use up some of their best soil. They have to have access to new territory. Where is that territory going to come? Manifest Destiny, right? It's going to come out west, right? If it's not in Virginia anymore, it's going to come in Alabama, Mississippi. If it's not in Alabama, Mississippi, it's got to come in Texas. If it's not in Texas, it's got to come in California, right? If it's not in California, it's got to come from South Dakota, right? Wherever we can go to grow cotton, we have to be free to do so. This was not the idea, you know, and Yankees continue to say, this. Look, you guys are fine to keep, you know, keep slavery in your existing bounds. We have no problem with that. Just don't bring it out west. And Southerners like, that's not an option for us. Our society is built upon cotton expansion. Cotton expansion means slave expansion. Means you have to have the West for slavery. Yankees say you can't have it. So consider the irony. The thing that unites us is the thing that divides us. Manifest Destiny paved over the differences between Northerners and Southerners. It created a whole new category of difference. And we'll see again and again and again between 1800 and 1860, this question of the expansion of slavery. Now, there'll be other things we'll talk about too, but the expansion of slavery is the most consequential in dividing Northerners and Southerners. We'll talk about one of those first incidences, the Missouri crisis, leading to the Missouri Compromise, as we said. Hopefully Zoom is, I didn't start this as a PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully by keeping it like this, Zoom will follow along with the screen changes. Everything I'm going to say for the next 10 minutes or so relates ultimately to the Missouri Compromise. I need to give you a lot of background, okay? We know that slavery was a part of the young United States. The Constitution did its best to try to avoid talking about it. It couldn't completely avoid talking about it, but we know that the Constitution certainly didn't contain in it any kind of end to slavery itself. Slave trade, yes. But we know that ultimately ending the slave trade was something that was very self-serving for the planters who had large numbers of slaves. For Thomas Jefferson, who had over 100 slaves, to say, let's end the slave trade. That's really easy for Jefferson to do that. He doesn't have to buy any more slaves. He's got enough. In fact, if Jefferson ends the slave trade, it hurts his competition. Because there were all kinds of guys out there wanting to get into commercial agriculture wanting to buy slaves, needing to buy slaves on the international market. And here's Jefferson coming along, claiming moral high ground. And let's end the slave trade. Well, you didn't have to oppose the international slave trade on moral grounds. If you were somebody like a Thomas Jefferson, you could oppose them on your economic self-interest. But we know the Constitution did not outlaw slavery. Sometimes students ask, why didn't the founding fathers deal with it? And you know the answer to this. We wouldn't have had a United States if we had tried to end slavery. There was no way, even with all of the moral discontent, all of the economic disruption to slavery in the 1770s, in the 1780s, even with all of that, it still was impossible to imagine ending slavery. Not so much on economic grounds as on what we might call the race war grounds, right? Honestly, in the 1770s, 1780s, the economic benefits of slavery were really ambiguous. Tobacco production was on its way out globally. Cotton production had not taken on. And so many Americans were wondering, like, what exactly are we going to do here? Which is why a George Washington or Thomas Jefferson could imagine, yeah, when I die, I'll just release my slaves then. And so people could imagine as tobacco production died, that slavery would die too. And then cotton production took off, obviously. But the argument for not ending slavery, for ending the slave trade but not ending slavery, Jefferson would make, he said, look, if we tried to end slavery here, I think he's writing in the 1780s, if we try to end slavery, we lose control over the slaves. If we lose control over the slaves, look, they already hate us, but they're under our discipline. If we release them from slavery, they're going to be so angry at us. They're going to rise up and kill us. It's the race war argument. The only way to avoid race war was to maintain the institution of slavery. And that was one of those arguments that until slavery became really economically profitable again under cotton production, but that would take until the 1820s at least. The main argument for not ending slavery in North America was the race war argument. We can't end slavery and not have some kind of race war, racial uprising. And so slavery persisted in southern states where slave populations were large. Slavery ended in northern states where slave populations had been low. But even in northern states, it's not like this. It's not like the former slaves that suddenly became like a part of society. We talked about this, right? Jim Crow segregation was developed in the North before the Civil War. Free blacks of the North faced intense economic, educational, social, and eventually political opposition. Northerners' primary answer to the question of, well, what is the place of, if we end slavery in North America in entirety, what's the answer? What do we do? Their main answer was colonization. The colonization movement would be centered on, you see on the board, that the American Colonization Society kind of, grows out of these desires for colonization. What is colonization? The idea of Northerners was, well, we freed our slaves. Now they'll go back to Africa. Virginia, you should end slavery. Get a bunch of ships, send slaves back to Africa. This is the main Northern answer to the question of after slavery, what? Right? Most Northerners, there's some exceptions, and we'll talk about them by name. For the most part, Northern answer to ending slavery was colonization. We'll end slavery, we'll put the freemen on boats, sail them back to Africa. There was one population in the North where colonization was really, really unpopular. Anyone want to guess what that population was. Guess who really didn't like the idea of colonization? Not them, because it's not going to affect them. The freemen themselves. Notice what I said. Put them on ships and send them back to Africa. There is no back. They weren't born in Africa. Free blacks of the North wrote poems and hymns and letters saying, would you knock this colonization nonsense off? We're not from Africa. We're from here. We don't want, there is no going back for us. Nevertheless, colonization remained popular. Abraham Lincoln supports a colonization project in 1863. It went badly, and a lot of historians think that if Lincoln had, lived after the Civil War, that he would not have pursued colonization anymore based on his experiences as president. That he would have tried to, come to some kind of greater accommodation of African American North America. But the primary Northern answer was no blacks out west, no blacks out east either. We're going to put them on ships and sail into Africa. Again, just because Northerners were anti-slavery does not mean that they were anti-racist. Northerners were intensely anti-racist. And so, barring some kind of, statement or action on the part of the Constitution or the federal government, this stuff is the slavery question is just worked out at the state level. Right? What you see in the midst of the American Revolution, before we even have a U.S. Constitution, is that some states ended slavery, some states chose to maintain slavery. The U.S. Constitution was ratified, and it chose to just not deal with that distinction. It chose to more or less say, oh, Pennsylvania wants to end slavery. That's fine. Virginia wants to keep slavery. That's fine. Right? That was a states' rights decision that the writers of the Constitution said, we're just going to let you guys handle it. Right? I mean, obviously, they debated whether they should abolish slavery outright, but ultimately they landed on, you know what? Let's just let states decide. And so states decided. And so as more states in the East formed, came into the Union, they decided this question, slave or free? Or northern states that had slavery between 1780 and 1820, they ended slavery. As southern states are coming in, like Alabama, Mississippi, they're choosing for slavery. This works out. This kind of free state, slave state distinction that runs through this whole period. It works as long as there's either a balance or Northerners have a little bit more of an edge. And everything has to do with representation in the national government, right? Look, House of Representatives representation is based upon population, right? You're a large state, you're going to have more representatives in the House of Representatives. You're small, it's smaller. Nothing southern states could do after 1820 to really deal with that issue. They had the smaller population, the North had the larger population. Northerners were going to control the House of Representatives the way it was. The Senate, however, is different. The Senate, whether you're a small state or a large state, it doesn't matter. You get 2 senators. That's the balance during these years that really needs to be maintained. And it is until 1819. In 1819, Missouri proposes to come into the Union as a slave state. Northern senators immediately start crunching the numbers, and they see If Missouri is allowed to come in as a slave state, southern states, slave states, are going to have 2 more senators than northern states. This is the first time the balance in the Senate was broken against the North. There had been an imbalance before favoring the North. Northerners were fine with that. This is the first time an imbalance threatened Northern control of the federal government. And Northern senators freaked out. They began putting all kinds of bills out trying to say, no slave expansion, no new states coming into the Union can have slavery. One of the early drafts even barred free persons of color from coming into any state out west. They said this was not this was not about fighting racism or anything like that. This was ultimately about trying to maintain, at least for white Northern senators, trying to maintain their racial utopia, their lily white vision of the West. Missouri coming in as a slave state threatened that vision, and they freaked out. All kinds of legislation, and Congress we'd had a rough decade in the 1790s, but for the past couple decades, just about 20 years or so, things have been all right since Jefferson until 1819. And this Missouri situation caused a crisis. Not so much, Americans themselves weren't so much freaking out, but our politicians, particularly Northern senators, are freaked out. Well, there's a reason we call it the Missouri Compromise, right? The Missouri crisis is ultimately settled. A venerable Northern senator named Henry Clay says, look, guys, we need to figure this out. Here's what we're going to do. Yeah, Missouri wants to come in as a slave state, but Maine, there's Maine up there. Maine wants to come in too. They want to come in as a free state. Let's just bring them in together. So 1820, let's bring them in together. Missouri come in as a slave state. Maine come in as a free state. Balance is maintained. Well, good, right? Northern senators say, nah. Because what happens when the next state wants to come in as slave? We're right back at it. Clay says, I see you. Pull out a map, pull out a pen, draws a line, the so-called 3630. Understand, you can't draw it all the way across. That's not our territory yet. That's Mexico. Actually, in that time, it's actually Spain, but that's not ours yet. So he draws the 3630 below Missouri over 3630 line. Where does it determine? Above the 3630, no slavery. Below the 3630, maybe slavery. If they want it, maybe slavery. Above 3630, no slavery. Let's kind of draw a line, divide the United States in half. Theoretically, we need to put a pin in this. Theoretically, you can imagine once the southwestern part of the United States comes into the Union, they just extend the 3630 line all the way across to California. Above the line, no slavery. Below the line, maybe slavery. Seems fair. That's the two parts of the Missouri Compromise. Again, if I ever go through any of this stuff quickly, look, this is all textbook stuff. This is all like Bill McClay stuff, right? I know that several of you have already read about the Missouri Compromise and can easily go back and review this stuff in your textbooks. Those are the two parts. You might even fact check me. Sometimes I get my basic facts wrong. So Bill might even make me look like a fool if you use them. Those are the two parts of Missouri Compromise, right? Missouri and Maine come in at the same time. We established the 3630, theoretically settling the slave expansion question for forever. So why is this important? I think for a couple of reasons. One, it shows that Americans are going to fight over slavery, but we're going to fight over the expansion of slavery. Right? At question here was not the morality of slavery. Politicians were fighting over the expansion of slavery and who would control the West. Two, this is not Southerners threatening disunion. This is Northerners. In fact, one Northern senator put it this way: "Sir," he said this on the congressional floor, "Sir, if a dissolution of the Union must take place, let it be so." It's not just Southerners, it's not just Thomas Jefferson who thought maybe this thing will not hold together, maybe this thing should not hold together. It's Northerners themselves who were willing to play the divorce card. If we don't get our way, if we Northerners don't keep control of Congress, divorce. That's because it's Southerners who finally in 1861 played the secession card. You need to understand through this entire period, Northerners and Southerners, for different reasons, but most frequently over the expansion of slavery. They'll play it on other issues too. But it's Northerners and Southerners playing the divorce card. Right? The Union is weak. As I said, the issues dating back to the American Revolution, what are we? A union or a confederacy? This question plagues the entire United States, not just the South. As it's either Northern politicians who are willing to say, yeah, we are so concerned about having our way, our vision of the West secure, that we're willing to let the whole thing go. But it doesn't. Right? I mean, here's kind of the great second crisis, the election of 1800, and one of these, is the country going to be able to hold together? Are we going to be able to have a peaceful transfer of power? In 1800 election said, yeah, we can do it. Now in 1819, it's another crisis. Can the Union hold together? Are we going to split North and South? Our politicians figure out how to get along. The crisis ends in a compromise. We're good to go. This American democracy thing that Europeans are looking at us and say, oh, stupid Americans, they can't govern themselves. We seem to be doing a pretty good job. Yeah, we got some pretty significant differences, some difficulties, but we get past them. So look, the Missouri Compromise, particularly in retrospect, is like, warning lights going off. But if we can kind of get into that particular time, not knowing what happens 30 years later, if we can just step into that time, it looked like the American system works. And so Americans rightly patted themselves on the back for getting over the Missouri crisis. And then Congress did something interesting. They passed a series of gag orders on themselves. You know what? We've settled the slave question once and forever. Missouri Compromise, we're good to go. Let's not talk about slavery anymore. Let's not talk about it. It became illegal to talk about slavery in Congress. We're not going to debate this issue. We've settled it. It's done. We're good to go. It's kind of like the parent who thinks, if I don't talk to my kids about sex, they're never going to think about sex and they're never going to have sex. Maybe that was your sex education. That was my sex education. How well does that work? We don't talk about sex, kids will never think about sex. That works really well, doesn't it? Well, that's what the United States essentially tried to pursue that strategy. If we don't talk about slavery, then we're not going to fight over the issue. And so Congress bars himself from talking about it. Guess what? In the 1820s, Americans started talking about slavery a lot more. Our politicians aren't, but Americans themselves are. And this is why I say, you know, the expansion of slavery argument explains a lot, but it doesn't explain everything. The reality is that some Americans do during these years. They do debate the morality of slavery questions. In the 1820s, there has always been an anti-slavery voice in North America. As majorities are building slavery, there have always been minorities saying what you're doing is wrong. Right? This is that, you know, this is the reason why people say, well, yeah, slavery is horrible, but everybody was doing it, so we really can't condemn them for what they were doing. It's a terrible argument, because in almost every period you can find a prophetic witness in what you guys doing are wrong. So the Puritans were enslaving Native Americans, and Roger Williams moves to Rhode Island and says, what you guys are doing is wrong. Americans ramp up the enslavement of African Americans in the 18th century, and Quakers stand there saying, what you guys doing is wrong. And in the 19th century, as slavery begins to expand once again with cotton production, there arises in the North a radical abolition movement. What makes this abolition movement, abolition means abolishing slavery. What makes the radical abolition movement radical is this group, not only did they believe that slavery should end, but they believed that racial equality and interracial fellowship should result. Right? The radical abolitionists rejected colonization. They rejected slavery. They rejected colonization. They advocated for anti-slavery and full racial equality. The Setters, that you would have read about these names in McClay's book if you haven't already. William Lloyd Garrison was a central figure, kind of a, you know, when we say that you know Christians were leading anti-slavery activists in American history, I mean that's truer for the 17th and 18th centuries. It's a little bit less true in the 19th century. We'll eventually talk about an evangelical group of anti-slavery activists in lectures after Thanksgiving, but the radical abolitionists, their connection to the Christian church and faith was really tenuous. They tended to be a lot more critical of Christianity. They talked a lot about white Christianity. They talked a lot about slaveholder Christianity, because in their experience, the Christians that they knew supported slavery. And so this idea that like they could be Christians in good faith with people who thought that slave owning and everything that went with slave owning was somehow consistent with the principles of Christianity. These radical abolitionists, they just weren't having it. So it's their connection of a William Lloyd Garrison. Yes, he's a pastor, but he's pretty disconnected from Christianity in the United States. Frederick Douglass, the ex-slave, really tenuous relationship with Christianity. A lot of the radical abolitionists were former slaves who were in the North. So free Black populations were kind of the rank and file of the radical abolitionists. But you did have some other white Northerners too. The Grimke sisters, for instance, who, you know, I mean, they were outside of Christianity. So, you know, religiously speaking, the radical abolitionists, I mean, they were Christian. They certainly quoted scripture. One of their favorite verses was Acts 17:26. I've talked about this verse before in a previous lecture, where, you know, Paul went before the Greeks in Athens and said, hey, God made us all of one blood. And the radical abolitionists were trying to communicate. Do you guys not understand your own Bible? Right? God made human beings in his image. white, black, red, black, brown, it doesn't matter. We're all made in his image. How can you justify the enslavement of people who bear God's image within them? So the radical abolitionists absolutely drew upon scripture, even though their connections with the church are tenuous. Here's the thing. The radical abolitionists were always a minority, right? They were always a really small group. But this is the dawn of the age of mass printing. We have printing technologies after 1800 that allow a small group or even an individual to become really influential. You know this. I mean, one guy with a cell phone anywhere in the world, theoretically, it's just one video, one TikTok video away from becoming like a world celebrity, right? This is the world you live in, right? This is a world that is beginning in the age of mass printing technology like this time. And so the abolitionists were always small. In fact, the anti-abolitionist movement was bigger than the abolitionists. The abolitionists were routinely beat up, their printing presses destroyed. Northerners hated these guys because, as I said, Northerners were pro-slavery. They wanted slavery to exist in its present bounds. They did not want to debate the morality of slavery. Because doing so could threaten the institution of slavery in the South, which meant that persons of color might be. The abolitionists were always small, but through the printing press, in Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, they exerted a broader influence than their numbers would suggest. Beyond the interracial fellowship, beyond the testimony that they provide us, that not everybody accepted the institution of slavery, not everybody was racist at this time, beyond kind of that service that they provide Americans today. We can say that the legacy of the liberators is that they're a polarizing force in a country that says, well, let's just stop talking about slavery. Garrison, Douglas, the liberators, the Liberator, they're all saying, nah, let's talk about it. Let's talk about slavery. Let's talk about how horrible it is. It's a polarizing force. And they're doing so at a time in which Southerners are at a turning point regarding the institution of slavery. Cotton production is taking off in the South. It's beginning to imagine slavery, cotton production and slavery with it becoming very profitable. Nevertheless, there's still talk of ending slavery, even in southern states. Maybe not Georgia or Alabama, but Virginia. There's still talk of ending slavery. There's even plans. Some states even develop plans. They could gradually end the institution of slavery. All that stops in 1830. All that stops in 1831 with Nat Turner's Rebellion. I'm not going to go into the details of Nat Turner's Rebellion. That's why we have the Maclay book. But the Nat Turner's Rebellion, it's the Great Southern Fear, right? The Great Southern Fear is if we don't keep our slaves under our control, they're going to rise up and kill us. Well, what was Nat Turner's Rebellion? It's that the group of slaves who rose up and killed a number of their oppressors. And so what you have in the 1820s and the 1830s is our government, our politicians, they don't want to talk about slavery anymore. They think they've settled it. Done issue. Meanwhile, the American people, they want to talk about it more. Northerners, particularly through printing endeavors like the Liberator, are saying, let's talk about this, let's debate this, let's see how we can end this. So there's a force growing in the North. Small, definitely small in the 1820s, but a force nonetheless that's saying slavery is wrong, let's end it. And they're saying this at the worst possible time. because Southerners are coming to their interpretation of Nat Turner's rebellion is not only can we not afford to end slavery, we need to double down. Slavery is going to rapidly expand after 1850. And the horrific nature of pre-Civil War slavery, one of the worst the world has ever known, is going to dramatically increase between the 1830s and the 1860s because of the response to Nat Turner's rebellion. Some of the harshest laws, harshest punishments, becomes illegal to teach a slave to read. Why? Because we don't want slaves like, oh, I don't know, like reading the wrong verse in the Bible, or we don't want slaves like reading a copy of The Liberator. The point is, after the Missouri Compromise is settled, the slavery question doesn't go away. Americans begin to debate slavery and its presence in American society. And politicians continue to think, well, maybe we can just, as long as we don't talk about it, this problem will just go away. Well, the slavery issue and the divisions between North and South are not going away. They're actually growing during these years. Now, it would be nice in history to just have a common explanation, right? To say it's slavery, it's slavery, it's slavery, but that's not what happens. The next great crisis of the Union between 1828 and 1832 only tangentially has to deal with slavery. That's the nullification crisis, and that's where we will start on Tuesday after Thanksgiving break. We're done. You guys have a good week and a half and off class. And happy Thanksgiving. If you need me, I'll be in California. Yeah, or COVID vacation. Yeah, we couldn't go last year, so.